Barefoot on the boardwalk, Della Whitfield pressed the baby tighter to her chest and held out her other hand, palm up, into the rain. "Please," she said, to anyone, to no one. "Just a coin. She hasn't eaten since yesterday." The rain came down cold and gray over Marino, running in the ruts of the street, soaking through what was left of Della's shawl. Men stepped around her without looking. A woman in a good wool coat crossed to the other side rather than pass close. Della's feet had gone past hurting into a kind of numbness, and the baby, little Ruth, had stopped crying an hour ago, which frightened her more than the crying had. She had been a wife once. Now she was nothing the town had a name for except trouble, and she had learned since her husband's death that trouble was catching, that people crossed streets to avoid it the way they'd cross away from fever. Get on now. The mercantile owner, Otis Beale, came out onto his own boardwalk with a broom, as if she were a stray dog to be swept off the step. "You're bad for custom, standing there like that. Go beg somewhere else." "I'm not begging to trouble you," Della said, and hated that her voice shook. "I only need—" "I don't care what you need." He raised the broom, not to strike her, only to punctuate the words, but she flinched back anyway, curling her body over the baby, and that was when she heard the horse. It came fast down the street, a big rangy bay, and pulled up hard enough to throw mud, and the man swung down before it had even fully stopped. He was tall and weathered, a rancher by his boots and the set of his shoulders, hat brimmed dark with rain, and he did not so much as glance at Otis Beale. He looked at Della, and at the small shape bundled against her, and something in his face went very still. "How long has that child been out in this?" he said. "I don't know you, mister," Della said, drawing back a step out of old habit, the habit of expecting the worst from strangers. "We're not your trouble." "Didn't say you were." He shrugged out of his own oilskin coat, heavy and dry beneath the wet outer surface, and held it out. When she didn't take it fast enough, he stepped in and put it around her shoulders himself, tucking it close over the baby with a gentleness that did not match the size of his hands. "Name's Lomax Ivers. I've got a wagon 2 doors down and a stove lit at my place 8 miles out. You don't have to trust me. But you're not standing in this rain 1 more minute if I've got breath to stop it." Otis Beale found his voice. "Now see here, Ivers, this woman's no concern of the town's. She's been round begging 3 days running, and if you go taking up with her—" "Was I asking you, Otis?" Lomax said, without heat, without even turning his head, and something about the quiet of it did what shouting could not have done. The broom lowered. Lomax looked back at Della. "There's a diner 2 streets over. Warm, dry food on the stove. I'll walk you there myself, and nobody in this town will say a word about it while I'm standing next to you. After that, what you do is your own business, but you'll eat first." Della looked down at Ruth, small and gray-lipped in the wet blanket, and felt the last of her pride go out of her like water down a drain. Pride did not feed a baby. She had learned that much in the weeks since the roof over her head had been sold out from beneath her, along with everything else her husband had owed for. "All right," she said, "for her, not for me." "Didn't ask which," Lomax said, and something in his voice, gruff and plain, sounded almost like relief. He walked beside her the 2 streets over with his hand hovering near her elbow, never quite touching, ready to catch her if her numbed feet gave out. And behind them, Della heard Otis Beale mutter something to another man about fools and charity cases, and heard Lomax's silence in reply, which was somehow louder than anything he might have said. Outside the diner, as they waited for the wagon to be brought round, the preacher's wife, Agatha Cutter, came down the church steps with 2 other women in tow, and stopped dead at the sight of Della in Lomax's coat. "Mrs. Whitfield." Agatha's voice carried the particular chill of a woman who considered herself charitable in principle and found the practice inconvenient. I do hope you're not troubling Mr. Ivers. We prayed for your husband's soul at services, you know, though the congregation did feel his debts were rather a scandal for a church-going family. We weren't a church-going family by the end, Mrs. Cutter, Della said, too tired for anything but plainness. There wasn't coin enough for the collection plate and supper both. There's no need for that tone. Agatha's eyes went to Lomax, assessing, and something in her expression sharpened with interest of a different kind. Mr. Ivers, you're a generous man, and the whole town knows it, but generosity can be taken advantage of. I'd hate to see you made a fool of by a woman with nothing left to lose. I'd hate to see a woman freeze to death on my boardwalk, while the church-going folk of this town discuss the propriety of feeding her, Lomax said. Good evening, Agatha. He handed Della up into the wagon himself, and if his jaw was tighter than it had been a moment before, he said nothing more about it, only clicked to the horses and left Marino's steeple behind them in the gathering dusk. Lomax Ivers had come to town for barbed wire, and left instead with a woman half drowned in rain, and a baby who did not look right at all. And he did not examine too closely why that seemed like the more important errand. He was 34 years old and had buried a wife 3 winters back, in a birth that had gone wrong in a way no doctor within 40 miles could fix, and he had told himself since then that the house he'd built for her was proof enough of what a man's plans were worth against the country's will. He ran cattle on land that had been good to him and cruel to him in turns, and he had gotten used to the particular silence of a house built for 2 people and lived in by 1. He watched the woman eat at the diner carefully, in small bites, like someone who had learned the hard way what happened to a starved stomach fed too fast, and watched her break off pieces of biscuit soaked in broth and coax them past the baby's slack lips, with a patience that told him she had not given up, even now, even soaked through and penniless and glared at by half the town through the diner window. "What happened to you?" he asked, when the worst of the shivering had stopped. She told him plainly, without asking for pity, which made him respect her more than if she had wept. Her husband, Amos Whitfield, had farmed 40 acres east of town and mortgaged it twice over without telling her, gambling and drinking away what the land made, and had died of a fever in the spring, owing money to half of Marino. The bank had taken the house. The store had taken the furniture against what he'd owed on credit. She had nothing left but the baby and the clothes on her back, and no family within 1,000 miles to take her in. "The town blames me for his debts," she said, "as if I signed the papers, as if I drank the whiskey." "Town's wrong then," Lomax said. "Wouldn't be the first time. You don't know that I'm not exactly what they say. A grifter, working a sad story on strangers." He looked at the baby, at the thin wrists, at the woman's own hands, cracked and reddened from work not idleness, and shook his head slowly. "I know grifters, ma'am. I've been swindled by better liars than you'd make. You're not that." He turned his hat in his hands, a man unused to saying what came next. "I've got a house too big for one man and a hired girl who quit on me last month to marry a drummer from Cheyenne. I need someone to keep it and cook, and you need work and a roof. I'm not asking anything else of you. Baby stays with you naturally. Wages besides room and board, whatever's fair. You can leave the day you find better." Della studied him with an exhaustion so deep it had gone past suspicion. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because I drove 8 miles into town for wire," Lomax said. "And I'm not driving 8 miles home telling myself I left a baby in the rain to save the cost of a spare bed." It was not romance. It was not even particularly warm, said as plainly as a man remarking on weather. But Della found that she believed him in a way she had believed almost no one since her husband's coffin went into the ground, and belief, just then, was worth more to her than any softer word could have been. The ranch sat in a fold of land with good grass and a creek running through it. And the house, when they came up on it in the last gray light, was bigger and finer than anything Della had lived in even before her husband's debts had eaten her marriage alive. She stood in the yard with Ruth wrapped against the cold and felt something in her chest crack open, not with relief exactly, but with the particular grief of remembering that a home like this had once been within reach of her own hopes, before Amos had spent hope along with everything else. The housekeeper's room was small but clean, with a good stove nearby for warming milk, and Lomax showed it to her without ceremony, then left her to it, saying only that supper was whatever she wanted to make of what was in the pantry, and that he'd take his meals whenever she had them ready. No schedule required. It took 3 days for Ruth's color to come back proper. 3 days of Della sitting up nights with the baby wrapped against the chill, feeding her broth by lamplight. And on the 4th morning, Lomax came in from the barn to find Della asleep sitting upright in the kitchen chair with the baby, finally, sleeping soundly against her shoulder, both of them breathing easy for the first time since the rain. He did not wake her. He built up the stove fire quiet as he could and went back out to his work, and something about coming into that sight, a woman and a child safe and warm under his roof, settled into him in a way he did not examine too closely either, not yet. The fever came for Ruth a week later, in the small hours, and Della woke to a heat coming off the baby's skin that frightened her worse than any hunger had. She tried cool cloths and prayer in equal measure, walking the small room until her legs shook, and when neither brought the fever down, she swallowed her pride entirely and went to Lomax's door, knocking with a hand that trembled. "She's burning up," Della said when he opened it, already half-dressed as though some instinct had woken him too. "I don't know what more to do." He did not hesitate. He had the buggy hitched inside 10 minutes and drove the 8 miles to the nearest doctor at a pace that risked the axle on the ruts, with Della in the back seat holding Ruth against her and murmuring every soft word she knew, and Lomax glancing back over his shoulder every few minutes as if he could will the road shorter by looking at it hard enough. The doctor, roused from his bed, pronounced it a lung fever common enough in babies who'd been chilled and underfed, serious but not, if watched closely, past saving, and gave them a tincture and instructions for steam and rest. Lomax paid the man before Della could reach for the coins she didn't have, and on the ride back, with Ruth's breathing easier and the tincture doing its slow work, Della found herself crying without meaning to, the fear of the last hours breaking loose all at once. "I'm sorry," she said, ashamed of the tears. "I don't cry easily. I haven't had the luxury of it most days." "Cry all you like," Lomax said, keeping his eyes on the dark road, his voice rough in a way that told her the fear had cost him something too. "Man have to be made of stone to sit through a night like this and not feel it somewhere. I was scared half to death myself, and she's not even mine by blood." "She might as well be, the way you drove that road tonight." "Might as well be a good many things," he said, quiet, and did not explain further. And Della did not ask him to, though she turned the words over in her mind the whole ride home, warmed by them more than by the blanket around her shoulders. Ruth mended within the week, and the whole household breathed easier for it. But something had shifted between Della and Lomax in that long night that neither of them tried yet to name. The trouble, when it came, wore the shape of a man named Jedediah Crane, who held the paper on what remained of Amos Whitfield's debts, and who arrived at the ranch on a bay mule 11 days after Della had come to stay, smelling of bay rum and carrying a leather satchel of documents like a threat. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not dismounting, looking down at her from the height of the saddle with an expression she recognized from other collectors in other doorways. "You've been hard to find. Your husband's estate owes $41 to my client, and the law allows for indenture where debt cannot otherwise be satisfied. I'm prepared to discuss terms, yours or the child's, once she's of use." The word indenture went through Della like a blade, colder than any rain had been. "You will not speak of my daughter that way," she said, and was surprised at the steel in her own voice. "There is no debt of mine to be satisfied by a child not yet a year old." "The law doesn't concern itself with sentiment, ma'am." "Then the law can wait for Mr. Ivers," said Lomax, who had come around the barn corner in time to hear the last of it, and something in his voice made Crane's mule sidestep, as though the animal, at least, understood a warning when it heard one. "Get down off that mule, Crane, or ride it back the way you came. Either way, you'll not speak of indenturing a baby on my land. This is a legal matter, Ivers, not a matter for a rancher's temper." "Then bring it to a judge in daylight with witnesses, and we'll see what a judge says about a grown man threatening to bind out an infant for $41 her mother never borrowed." Lomax's hand rested easy on the top rail of the corral fence, not reaching for anything, but the stillness of him said more than reaching would have. "Until then, you're trespassing, and I'll thank you to remember it." Crane's mouth thinned, but he was not, Della saw, a man who fought battles he could lose. He gathered his reins. "I'll be back with the sheriff and the paper both, Ivers. This isn't finished." "Bring the sheriff," Lomax said. "He knows me. He'll want to hear the part about the child." When Crane had ridden off, Della found her hands were shaking, and Lomax, without asking, took them both in his, rough and warm and steady. "He can't have her," he said. "Not while I've got a say in it." "You don't owe me a say in it," Della said, though she did not pull her hands free. "You've done more for us than any stranger owes." "Maybe I'm not doing it as a stranger anymore," Lomax said, and looked, for the first time since she'd known him, faintly unsure of his own words, a big steady man caught off guard by his own heart. "Maybe I haven't been for a while." There was a barn raising the following Saturday for a young couple newly settled south of town, the kind of gathering where the whole county turned out with hammers and covered dishes, and Lomax asked Della, plainly, whether she'd come along and help with the cooking, since half the ranch wives would be there, and she oughtn't spend every waking hour shut up in his kitchen with no company but a baby and a rancher too tired to talk after supper. She went uneasy, half expecting the reception Agatha Cutter had shown her, and for the first hour that was exactly what she got. Women drawing their children closer as she passed, conversations that dropped to murmurs, a wide berth left around the table where she set down her dish of stewed apples. But a stout, gray-haired woman named Hattie Finn, who ran cattle alone since her own husband's death, and had no patience left in her for other people's cruelty, planted herself down next to Della without asking and struck up a conversation about canning that lasted the better part of an hour. "Don't mind them," Hattie said, low, nodding toward the knot of women by the punch table. "I buried a husband too, and half this county whispered I'd poisoned him just for being a widow with land worth having. Whispering's cheap. Takes no courage at all. You keep your chin up, and in a year they'll have found someone else to talk about." By the afternoon, when the barn frame stood raised against the sky and the fiddler struck up something quick, Lomax crossed the whole yard in front of everyone, in front of Agatha Cutter and Otis Beale and every gossiping tongue in Merino, and asked Della to dance, plain as anything, as though there were not a soul present who might think ill of it. "You don't have to do that," Della murmured, even as she took his hand. "You don't have to prove anything on my account." "Not proving anything," Lomax said. "Just dancing with a woman I like the company of, same as any man here's entitled to do." And if his hand rested a shade too warm at her waist, and if he did not look away from her face the whole length of the song, the county took note of it, and talk in Marino began, slowly, to shift from scandal to speculation of quite a different, gentler kind. The second trouble came from the bank, and it came for Lomax, not for Della, though it landed on both of them alike. He had lost 40 head of cattle to a bad blizzard 2 winters back, the same winter his wife had died, and had borrowed against the spring calving to make it through. And the note had come due that autumn with the bank in Marino, unwilling to extend it further, not since Otis Beale, who sat on the loan committee, had taken against him for the trouble of Della's presence at his ranch. Man's harboring a debtor's widow and her indentured obligations, Beale told the banker, loud enough in the saloon that it reached Lomax's ears within the day. No telling what liabilities he's taken on along with her. Banks got no business extending further credit to a man tangled up in another man's unpaid debts. It was petty, and it was personal, and it worked exactly as Beale intended. The bank called the note early, 30 days to pay in full or lose the ranch to foreclosure, land, cattle, house, and all. Lomax did not tell Della at first, not wanting to add his trouble to hers, but she found the letter on his desk while dusting, and she was too plain-spoken a woman, even in another man's house, to pretend she hadn't. "You're going to lose this place," she said, "because of Otis Beale's spite over me being here." "I'm going to lose it because I borrowed against a bad winter same as any rancher does," Lomax said. "Wasn't your doing." "It was partly my doing, and you know it." She set the letter down with careful hands, feeling the old weight of being the trouble that followed her wherever she went, the debt that swallowed up other people's good fortune along with her own. "Perhaps I should go, before I cost you the only thing you've got left of her." She did not say the dead wife's name, but they both understood it. "Don't," Lomax said, sharper than he meant to, and then gentler. "Don't you dare talk about leaving like it'd fix anything. This ranch was built on hard winters before you ever set foot on it. If it falls, it won't be because a good woman and her baby needed a roof. It'll be because a small man used my kindness as a weapon, and I'll not let him have the satisfaction of thinking it worked." He worked the 30 days like a man possessed, driving cattle to a buyer 2 counties over who'd pay better than Marino's market, mending fence, calling in favors from ranchers who owed him from leaner years of their own. And Della worked alongside him in whatever way a woman with a baby on her hip could, keeping account books straight, feeding the men who came to help, nursing a hand Lomax tore open on wire, and refusing to let him ignore it the way he wanted to. They scraped together enough, in the end, parting with more cattle than either of them liked, to satisfy the note 3 days before the deadline, and Otis Beale's spite bought him nothing but the bank's mild annoyance at the wasted trouble. But the note paid did not end it. Crane came back as promised, this time with the sheriff riding beside him, papers in hand. On the very evening, the sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind had begun driving hard out of the northwest, carrying the smell of a storm bigger than any that autumn had yet thrown at them. Della heard the horses first, over the baby's fussing, and came out onto the porch with Ruth on her hip to find Crane and the sheriff, and behind them, Otis Beale himself, come to see the debtor's widow put in her place at last. "Sheriff Talmadge has reviewed the estate," Crane announced, raising his voice over the rising wind. $41 remains owed. Mrs. Whitfield has no means to pay. The law permits indenture of the child until the debt is discharged by her labor in adulthood, or immediate payment by any party willing to settle the note. "That is monstrous," Della said, "and you know it is monstrous, or you'd not need a sheriff standing behind you to say it aloud." "Sheriff," Lomax said, coming around from the barn with his coat already soaked from the first fat drops of rain, You rode all this way in a rising storm to collect $41 off a baby. Talmadge had the grace to look uncomfortable. The law's the law, Ivers. I don't love enforcing it this way any more than you love watching me. Then I'll pay it, Lomax said, and dug into his coat for the small purse he kept for wages, counting out the bills into Crane's startled hand before the man could so much as protest. $41, paid in full in front of a lawman as witness. Now tear up that paper, Crane, and get off my land before this storm breaks, because I promise you, you don't want to be caught on the flats east of here once that creek rises. Crane, staring at the money as if it had personally offended him, tore the paper as instructed, sullen and beaten. And it was in that moment, with the debt settled and the wind screaming up out of the northwest, that a rider came pounding up the lane, shouting that the creek had already jumped its banks 2 miles up and was coming down fast, and that cattle were stranded on the low flats where Lomax had moved the herd for autumn grazing not 4 days before. There was no time for anyone to be glad of the debt settled. Lomax was already running for the barn, shouting for his hands to saddle up, and Della, without a moment's thought for how it would look, thrust Ruth into the sheriff's startled arms, hold her, and don't you dare let her out of your sight, and ran for the second horse herself. You can't come, Lomax said, swinging up onto his bay. This isn't safe ground even for men who know it. I grew up on a river farm before I ever met Amos Whitfield, Della said, already mounting, skirts and all, with a competence that surprised him even in the chaos of the moment. I know rising water, Lomax Ivers, better than half your hands do. You'll need every rider you've got before this night is through, and I am not going to stand on that porch and wait to learn whether you drowned. He did not argue further. There was no time, and something in her face told him arguing would cost more than it would win. The flats, when they reached them, were already half underwater, dark shapes of cattle bawling in confusion, where the rising creek had cut them off from the higher ground. The storm now full upon them, with rain coming sideways, and lightning enough to see by in flashes, that made the whole scene look like something remembered rather than lived. Lomax and his 3 hands worked the herd from horseback, driving what cattle they could toward the ford before the water rose past a horse's ability to cross it. And Della, true to her word, worked the flank where the current ran meanest, keeping calves from bolting the wrong direction into the deepening water. It was in that work that Lomax's horse went down, stepping into a washed-out gully hidden beneath the rising water, throwing him hard into the current, and Della's heart stopped entirely for the length of time it took her to see him surface, gasping, one arm plainly wrong at the shoulder, being carried by the current toward the deep cut where the creek narrowed and ran fastest. She did not think. She turned her own horse into the water, driving it hard against the current, reaching the low branch of a cottonwood that leaned out over the narrow cut, and threw herself along it, one hand locked around a limb, the other stretched out toward the water, screaming his name into the storm. Lomax, here, reach for me. He saw her or heard her, or some instinct older than sight found her in the dark, and he kicked toward the branch with his good arm, and for one endless moment the current had him and did not want to let go. And then her hand closed on his wrist, her grip torn and bleeding from the rough bark, and she held, screaming for the nearest hand to help her, until 2 of Lomax's men reached them and hauled him, half drowned and gray with cold, up onto the bank. "Don't you dare," Della said, on her knees beside him in the mud and the rain, pressing her hands to his face. "Don't you dare leave that baby without the only father who ever wanted her. Do you hear me? Lomax Ivers, don't you dare." He coughed water and looked up at her with an expression that, even half drowned, held something like wonder. "Wasn't planning on it," he managed. "Not now that I've got someone worth staying for." They got the herd to high ground before the worst of the flood took the low flats entirely. Lost 11 head to the water but no men. And in the end, no woman either, though Lomax would say for years after that he'd nearly lost the finest thing in his life to that creek, and had learned his lesson about arguing with her over what she was and wasn't capable of. Della set his shoulder herself, with a competence born of the same river farm she'd spoken of, and sat with him through the worst of the fever that followed his dunking in the cold water, changing cloths and coaxing broth into him through 2 long nights, while Ruth slept in a basket pulled close beside the bed. And it was Otis Beale himself, oddly enough, who arrived 2 days later with an apology so stiff it might have cracked. Having heard from Sheriff Talmadge exactly how the woman he'd swept off his boardwalk with a broom had gone into a flooded creek after midnight to pull a rancher out of the current with her bare hands. Hattie Fenn came too, that same week, bringing a chicken pie and no pretense at all, and sat with Della at the kitchen table while Lomax slept off the worst of the fever upstairs. "Told you it'd turn," Hattie said, cutting the pie. "Nothing changes gossip's mind faster than a woman proving she's got more grit than the men doing the talking." "Town's talking different now," Beale admitted, hat in his hands, looking anywhere but at Della's face. "Talk of what you did out there. I expect I owe you an apology, Mrs. Whitfield. It was ill said, what I said to you in the rain." "It was," Della agreed, without softening it for his comfort. "But I'll accept the apology all the same, for Ruth's sake if not my own. She'll grow up in this town. I'd rather she grow up in a kinder one than the one I found." It was a fair answer, and Beale took it as such, and left without further argument. And Marino's opinion of Della Whitfield did, in fact, turn in the weeks that followed, the way opinion in small towns tends to turn once it has been shown plainly to be wrong. Lomax's shoulder healed slower than his pride, but heal it did, and it was on a clear cold evening in early winter, with Ruth finally strong and round-cheeked and sleeping in the cradle he had built her with his own 2 hands during the long nights of his recovery, that he took Della's work-roughened hand in both of his, and asked her, plainly, the way he did everything, whether she would consider making the arrangement between them permanent, in the eyes of the law and the church both. Not out of obligation for a rescue owed either direction, but because he could not any longer imagine the house, or the years ahead of him, without her and the child both in it. "I never thought I'd want anything again after Amos," Della said, "and I never thought a man could love a child that wasn't his blood the way you love her. But you do. I've watched you do it every day since the rain." "She's mine the day I decided she was," Lomax said. "Same as her mother is, if her mother will have me." "Barefoot and begging is how you found me," Della said, laughing despite the tears standing in her eyes. "And I never thought I'd be grateful for a rainstorm as long as I lived." "I never let a hungry thing go unfed in my life," Lomax said, drawing her against his good shoulder, careful of the other. "And I wasn't about to start with the 2 people who have since become the whole of my reason for getting up in the mornings." Outside, the first snow of the season had begun, soft and quiet against the windows of a house no longer built for one man's grief, but for a family that had come to him, against all the town's cruel certainty, out of the worst rain Marino had seen in a decade, and stayed, through flood and threat and the slow turning of hard hearts, for good.